Greetings, ladies and metal-gents, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called Their Duty, written by Teller of Tall Tales. Detective Clevens looked over the scene in shock. At least a dozen dead, bodies broken and twisted. One, a Gorvan, even had the broken blade of a small knife sticking out of their chest carapace. The car of a bullet train was splattered with Technicolor blood, and Cleven's talon covers were beginning to soak it up. He glanced over at the victim, a small Martian girl who was tearfully receiving medical checkup in a Medicraft. Despite there being 4 witnesses to the event, the story hadn't changed. His sharp eyes slowly turned to the lone, dark-skinned human in dirty, ragged clothing. An emergency medical technician was squeamishly watching as the man calmly stitched a long gash on his arm closed with a monofilament suture. He sighed and glanced at his partner. "Run me through it one more time." Officer Cull sighed deeply as well, making a stressed gurgling sound as he looked through his report, gesturing at the adolescent rabbit with their throats split open. "Witnesses report that these 14 individuals boarded the train being loud and boisterous. Our friend outside had been sitting alone in the back of the train car, there." He used his tentacle to point out a seat where the leather bag still sat, right next to the door that led into the next car. "Now, after about 2 stops, this one decided to try and assault our victim, the Mousian. Witnesses reported that the victim had repeatedly denied their perpetrator's advances. When the perp decided to get physical, Miss Slave stated that he had grabbed her by the collar. Our unknown," he pointed to the man outside, who was now splinting his own broken fingers, "reportedly stood up and then shouted, and I quote, 'Get your grubby paws off of her. She said no,' before pulling out a small folding pocket knife and pointing it at the group. It was then that our perpetrator decided to ignore our wild card and tried to assault Miss Slave. Reports conflict slightly on what exactly happened next, but the most cohesive report from Miss Slave herself states that our wild card proceeded to rush the perpetrator. There was a struggle, and WC tore his throat open with a knife. The other perps then ganged up on our WC in an attempt to either subdue or kill him. That part is still unclear. Security footage only caught from this one. He gestured at the Zelaxian with the blunt false trauma wounds and a missing head. WC had mopped up the Ranat, 2 Golvaran and Gegnosian before the camera could start recording. Keith pointed to where the handrail had been snapped off. The Zelaxian had ripped off the handrail to defend themselves, but our WC managed to disarm them and use the handrail to brutal effect before holding the Zelaxian's head out the window while the train was moving. We found it roughly a mile back along the tracks where it had gotten embedded into a tree growing near the tracks. After that, WC proceeded to beat the remaining perpetrators to death with a handrail after giving them a chance to surrender. Naturally, they continued to try and fight their way out of the situation. Kelth finished the report with a deep, moist breath of disbelief. He waved a tentacle around in amazement before his 12 eyes focused on Detective Clevens. "He still hasn't said anything to me or the guys from the precinct, but we checked his ID. He was part of the 1st Terran Marines during the siege of Granitor 6. Heard you also fought in that conflict, so we thought that you might be able to get something out of him." Clevens nodded softly, clicking his talons together as he turned his heel toe. "I'll try. Terran Marines can be a tight-lipped bunch, but I know how to talk to them." Stepping out of the train car, Detective Clevens yanked off his body camera and audio recorder in full view of the man, before calmly sitting across from him and pulling out a pack of cigarettes and a flask of whiskey. Taking a pull from the flask and lighting the cigarette, he offered the human a smoke and a drink. The Marine smiled softly and took a cigarette and the flask, taking a long pull from it before grinning softly. "Granitor corn whiskey. Some call it the worst in the galaxy. But in the trenches, it was like the gods' ambrosia." Clevens finished the old saying with a soft ruffling of his neck feathers, the closest he could come to approximating a return smile. The human looked back at the train car and asked, "Is she okay?" "Shaken up, but otherwise unharmed. Probably going to need therapy." The man softly. "Guess I overdid it." Clevens shrugged softly. "Maybe. I'm more concerned about why you did it. You could have gotten yourself killed." The Marine looked up into Clevens' eyes, smile fading softly as he smoked the cigarette pensively. As a Marine, my duty was to kill the enemy and protect my battle brothers. Clevens nodded, letting the man collect his thoughts. The Marine's eyes watching the small Mousie as she received some sedatives to counteract the panic from the stressful situation. You were there on Granitor. I can see it in your eyes. Do you remember what it was like when we entered the city? Clevens paused for a long moment, accepting the flask back and taking a large pull. I do. I still have nightmares about sifting through the burn pits, finding those bones too small to be an adult's eye. I remember finding those nobles holed up in their bunks, fat as ticks. I remember not seeing what happened to them. The Marine nodded slightly and took a drag of their cigarette, 1,000-yard stare fixed on some point off in the distance. I did my duty as a soldier well that day, but I also did my duty as a human being just as well, if not better. His eyes grew a little misty as he looked back at the train car. Just like back then, I did my duty as a human today. He looked at Clevens in the eyes before continuing, wiping tears away with his untorn sleeve. I couldn't protect them then, but I can and did protect her today. Whatever comes next doesn't matter. I did my duty. That is what matters. Detective Clevens nodded softly before raising his talons and patting the Marine on the shoulder, snapping a Terran salute. I'll put it in my report, but you should still expect a court summons in the coming weeks. The Metropolis is probably going to try and label you as a vigilante still. Semper Fi, Marine. The Marine smiled softly and finished the cigarette, returning the salute before replying, Do or die. Detective Clevens picked up his body cam and audio recorder, leaving the Marine his flask, as he headed for his vehicle. He hated paperwork, and there was going to be a lot of it to do when he got back to the office. End of story. Story number 2. The Weekend War, written by Coyote Havoc. How do you defeat the humans? The question had been asked and pondered since the first war humanity had fought against the extraterrestrial species, known by several of those species by different names, the Short War, the Eldrizzle Failure, and, as the humans call it, the Weekend War. In the human calendar, which had been in use for over 1,000 years at that time, the Eldrizzle invasion of Earth had been planned for Saturday, October 25th, 2600. It remains a point of uncertainty why that specific date was chosen for the planetary conquest of Earth. Eldrizzle claimed that it was a day most humans took their weekends to relax, and an invasion shortly before their harsh winters would catch them flat-footed and unable to strike effectively. What transpired has been considered the worst planning, judgment, and hubris in recorded history. The invasion began with a standard blockade and a systematic eradication of human satellite network, thought to be a widely successful coup against their communications and observation systems. The invasion commenced in earnest. Humanity, believed incapable of coalescing into a united force due to their own divisions, would therefore be subjected to the rescue strategy where their more powerful nations would be assaulted first and their lesser nations absorbed later by pitting them against each other. Though successful in other invasions against primitive species, humans had been aware of this strategy, naming it divide and conquer. It was around this point in the invasion that the Eldrizzle admit to a slight miscalculation on their part. Since China and Russia, as well as the United States and Canada, shared a land border, a full 2 divisions were sent to conduct a shock and awe operation by entering the atmosphere over the North Pacific before splitting into 2 task forces. The primary problem was that all 4 of these nations constantly monitored their counterpart from land-based stations. China and Russia were the first to engage the Eldrizzle, believing the task force to be the first strike from the United States and Canada, employing their respective theater defense systems to eliminate the threat. Only one vessel was able to avoid the hail of incoming munitions, only to become the first killed by the Mongolian Navy in a millennium. Disappointed, Eldrizzle commanders focused on a far more successful assault on the United States and Canada, where transports had successfully landed their troops. Initially believed to be quite successful, it was therefore humiliating to learn what hunting season meant in the most painful way imaginable. Surviving troops would later recall a gun behind every blade of grass and humans trying to figure out what their tag limit was. Eventually, the United States and Canada responded to the violation of their sovereignty by setting the tag limit to 7 Aldrissel per tag. At some point between being camped and pawned, the North Americans as well as farmed for experience by the Russia and China, it was agreed upon by those 4 nations that this was not the opening stages of a nuclear conflict, but a bona fide alien invasion, and all 4 agreed to set aside their differences for the time being to address the present threat. Meanwhile, a 3rd task force had managed to penetrate the rainforests of Brazil, only to find the humans were not the most dangerous creatures inhabiting the planet. Aldrissel had fallen in droves to fish known as piranhas and arapaima. The Aldrissel survivors surrendered immediately in Manus upon seeing humans eating the same fish that had thinned their numbers so significantly. Their primary attack strategy completely ruined in what would be called the Blonde Moment by humanity in later years. Aldrissel commanders decided to send forces to their largest continent and their smallest in an attempt to find foothold that they could exploit and hold while reinforcements were requested, so as to not make the same mistakes twice. Instead of splitting their forces upon entry, they decided on a pincer attack from the planet's north and south, Scotland and South Africa respectively, and from up upon completion with the Mediterranean in between both strike forces. The vessels departed on their descent on early Sunday morning and quickly encountered residents, which is hotly debated to this day. I would like to know the human answer whether South African mercenaries are more dangerous than men in brightly colored skirts, but the outcome of the battles, known as Fafo Sunday, are enough to give any race pause before asking. Finally, one last desperate attempt was suggested about the same time as the humans made contact with what little remained of the fleet, to which the human in charge of Australia replied, "We lost a war to our emo population once." By Sunday evening, the Aldrissel had surrendered. End of story. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Dragon Soup, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Red Panda 121, Leslie 517, Bushmaster 177, Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Sans the Skeleton, Light Jock, Dragzoon WRE, and Lord Azrakal. Thank you very much.